Okie pokey. Um, let's do it. This is the Dark Ages 1 video. Um, so, uh, we're gonna do some fun stuff. We're almost at the end. There's only 4 videos after this one. So if you've been knocking your way through them to get to the end, you're so close. You're so close. You can do it. I believe in you. Maybe I'm talking to myself. Uh, I can do it. I believe in me. Right? Something like that. Anyway. Okay. Um. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give you an overview of sort of where we are, and I think I have a little graphic that may help you. So we just came out of the classical era, which is to say, an era that starts with the post Dark Age era in Greece and goes through the Hellenic era, where Greece is dominant, and then through the Hellenistic era, um, and then through Rome's dominance of things. All of these are sort of lumped together into the term the classical era. Uh, and that is sort of what ends around 500 CE with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And then about 1,000 years later, over in 1500 CE, we get the beginning of the Renaissance, which is French for rebirth. Um, rebirth. Now, the period in between from 500 CE to about 500 to about 1500, so about 1,000 years. That period is the Middle Ages, aka, if we're going to be all French about it, the medieval period. But that period is the Middle Ages. Now, the funny thing is, and I'm hoping that this will help you, that this graphic will help you, I mean. When I was younger and people talked about the Middle Ages, it never occurred to me to ask, what is it in the middle of? I just never thought about it. I just thought, oh, there's the Middle Ages. It's the Middle Ages. I never thought, in the middle of what? Um, but the Middle Ages are in the middle of periods of humanism. In the classical era, we saw a flourishing of humanism. We saw humanistic forms of government like Greek democracy and Roman republicanism. We saw the development of philosophy, engineering, medicine, all kinds of stuff. Now, things took a hit. The humanism of the classical era took a hit with Rome's changeover to an autocracy. That's true. But, so things kind of flattened out. The curve kind of flattened out. But in the Dark Ages, what's going to happen, in the Middle Ages in general, what happens is uh, the humanism of the classical era drops off sharply. And over the course of the Dark Ages, it slowly recovers. We recover a humanistic perspective slowly. Between 1000 and 1100, we get a big climb in humanism. Well, maybe not that steep, but how about here? We have a lot of humanistic ideas in the High Middle Ages, and then when we get to the Renaissance or the rebirth of what? The rebirth of humanism! Yay! The rebirth of humanism. Ta-da! And specifically in the Renaissance, they're going all the way back to classical humanism. They're looking back to Greece and Rome as their examples. So the Middle Ages represent a period of time in Western Europe that is in the middle of the development of humanism in Europe. And the Middle Ages can be divided roughly into two periods: the Dark Ages, which that name is kind of not popular among historians now, and I think they're being too precious about it. I think it fits just fine. They're like, oh, wasn't really all that dark. I'm like, it kind of was. The Dark Ages, which run from about 500 to 1000, so which represent sort of the first half of the Middle Ages. And then there's a transitional period between 100 and 1000 where a lot of things change very quickly. And that brings us to the High Middle Ages, where everyone is very high all the time. No, I'm kidding. The High Middle Ages, which were on the top shelf. No, I'm kidding. The High Middle Ages, where everyone was very tall. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. The High Middle Ages, which is where most of the stuff that we think of as being medieval really happens. Jousting and a complex hierarchy of kings and dukes and earls and counts and all that stuff, and a king who is sort of really powerful and controls everything rather than just being some little local pissant who isn't very whereas his whole kingdom is the size of like Tulsa County or something. That's all Dark Ages stuff. The High Middle Ages stuff is the stuff we tend to think of: big stone castles. That's High Middle Ages stuff. And so the High Middle Ages last from about 1100 to 1500, and represent sort of a period of time. Ironically, the stuff that we think of as being real medieval is when the Middle Ages, the medieval period, was becoming rapidly less medieval. It was becoming very, very much less medieval than it had been, and it was a period of recovery from the devastating collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and then we get to the Renaissance, which I'll talk about later. But anyway, so basically what we're going to be talking about over the next few videos is the Middle Ages. We're going to start by talking about the Dark Ages. We're going to talk about the transitional period to the High Middle Ages. And then we're going to finish off the class by talking about sort of how the High Middle Ages transition into the Renaissance. Humanities 2 starts with the Renaissance and goes from there. So if you're interested in it, and it's a very interesting time period, cool stuff is happening. It goes from the Renaissance up to the modern era. So if that interests you, you should definitely do Humanities 2. So, okay. So that's, hopefully this little graphic is giving you a better understanding of what the Middle Ages are and the way it breaks down into the two phases of the Middle Ages. And so hopefully that's been useful. Okay. Okay. So let's start with this. The Dark Ages of Europe. Okay. We're in another Dark Age. Crap. Dark Age of Europe. Another Dark Age. We've been through this before with Greece. So this is the same thing that we saw with the Greek Dark Age. What happened is, thanks to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of feudalism, which is super terrible for trade and terrible for public institutions, that is, they're basically gone. We talked about that in the last video. What we have is a time period where there's a drastic reduction in urban populations. Cities, some cities just sort of vanish entirely. Other cities survive, but with a big drop in population. I told you about Rome. Rome in during the Pax Romana had 1 million people. Rome in the last days before the collapse had maybe 100,000, and Rome during the Dark Age probably less than that. These urban populations are going away. And with the urban populations going away, we have the people who aren't farmers, the people who are practicing artisan skills, who rely upon farmers to produce excess food to feed them. Those people are going away. Um, we have scholars whose literacy allows them to read the text. Those are going away. And the books that they have are going away. If no one can read them, why keep them? They could be burned for fuel. Countless works of literature and all kinds of stuff of philosophy, of medicine. These things were lost during the Dark Age. Um, okay. There is a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization that Morgan just reminded me of. Um, and it is basically about how Irish monks copied bunches and kept copies of a lot of works, and kind of preserved a lot of stuff that might have otherwise been lost from the classical era through the Dark Ages and into the High Middle Ages, when there was a recovery of a lot of this stuff. So it's a good book. It's an interesting bit of popular history. Um, the Irish monks weren't the only monks copying things. The title is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's a good read and it's not very long. So I highly recommend it. It's a very successful piece of popular history, as popular history books go. That one's a really really good one. It's well written and it's very informative. Um, uh, there's also one called The Swerve, which has to do with the end of the High Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. But we're not there yet. I'll mention that one when I get to that video. Anyway, so yeah, we've been through Dark Ages before when we talk about the Greek Dark Age. And this is a similar situation. The people of Dark Ages Europe lived in the ruins of the Roman Empire, and they knew the Roman Empire had been objectively more accomplished and greater than the society that they had. They knew that the Roman Empire had laws and institutions. It had aqueducts and roads and all that stuff. Things that they were incapable of doing, literally in some cases. In the Dark Ages, the secret of Roman concrete was lost. So people living next to like Roman aqueducts literally knew that the aqueducts were made of certain kinds of materials that resembled stone but wasn't stone, and they didn't know how to make it. They didn't know what it was. It would be like living next to like an alien civilization that was much more advanced than yours, and you could see their technology but you didn't know how to make it. It was kind of kooky. Um, so anyway, so this is the Dark Age of Europe. It's a pretty despairing time, an age that was defined by violence, because remember the characteristics of feudalism. Um, Feudalism became the rule all over Europe, and it was a violent society, run by violent people, and it was not a super great place to be living. We're going to talk about, in specific, I'm going to highlight, because there's a lot to talk about in the Dark Ages, and I can't go over the whole damn period with you. Um, but what I am going to do is I'm going to highlight one group of people and then one person, and I'm going to contrast them. In one, the group of people sort of fueled the violence of the Dark Ages. They were a symptom of the violence of the Dark Ages. And the other in the other case, there's a person who tried to pull Europe out of the Dark Ages and failed, but made a noble effort. So okay, so let's start by talking about. Let's start by talking about. Okay, we'll start by talking about the Vikings. You may have heard of Vikings. They play in Minnesota. Sorry. No. You may have heard about the Vikings. The Vikings were. Viking is not just a generic word for anyone from Scandinavia. Scandinavia represents sort of Iceland here, and Norway, Sweden, and these other countries, Denmark down here. These are the Scandinavian countries. And a Viking is not just a generic term for someone from Scandinavia. The Vikings were a particular group of people, almost a particular phase in Scandinavian culture. So from around 850 to 1050, groups of Scandinavian warriors, especially young men, set out from Scandinavia and raided places like northern England, Ireland, the northern coast of France, Germany, and so on and so forth. They would set out in longboats that allowed them to travel quickly and allowed them to move sort of stealthily up the coast of their targets. And when they got there, they would attack their targets, usually monasteries. The attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in, I want to say it's 847. I'm not 100% sure of that date. Lindisfarne is a monastery, or was a monastery in, 739. In 739. Or 793. 793. So that wasn't 850 to 1050. That was, sorry, that was 800 to 1050. So the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 is sort of like the first big attack of the Viking Age, and that kind of kicks off the Viking Age. The Vikings attacked the monastery, and they killed the monks, and they stole the gold crosses and the gold plates and things like that the monastery had, things that had been created from offerings that were given to the monastery. They stole the treasures of the monastery and then went back to Scandinavia. Now, why would someone do this? Why leave your homeland, sail across some territory, land on a foreign shore, attack a local village, kill a bunch of people, steal everything in the village, and then sail home? Why do it? Well, there was no Netflix. No, sorry. I'm hilarious. I don't care what you think. There was no Netflix, which is objectively true. There wasn't, but I don't think that's the reason. It was a combination of factors. Scandinavia at this point in time was growing. The population was growing, and there wasn't a lot of super good farmland available. There were a lot of young men who did not have farmland available to them. They had no way to make a living, in other words. This is actually depicted fairly accurately in the opening episodes of the TV show Vikings, where the main character there's a meeting in his village, And basically, they talk about the fact that agricultural land, farmland, is in short supply. And he doesn't have any farmland. He doesn't have any way to live, literally. He can't grow food to support himself and his family. So he's got to do something. What can he do? Well, it turns out also around this time, because of the spread of Christianity in medieval Europe, which we're going to talk about at a different period in a different video. Because of the spread of Christianity in medieval Europe, there were a ton of monasteries all over the place that were, by their nature, because they're monasteries, that were isolated, but also they had a lot of wealth in them. They had a lot of treasure in them. And so they're isolated, nobody there knows how to fight, and they're wealthy. Okay, that was enough. Basically, young men with no real options for how to support themselves, um, with no real options for how to support themselves in their homelands, took off from Scandinavia and took advantage of the fact that the Scandinavian people in this period were very good sailors and had a good sort of technology with their boats. They had well-made boats, so they took advantage of the fact that they were good sailors and that they had sort of nothing to lose, and they went to these places and raided for anything they could get that they could then bring home and trade for food. Um, so basically, they became professional. There was a whole class of disaffected young men who could not do farming because there wasn't enough farmland left in their homeland, who became professional Vikings. This was how they supported themselves. They would go out on raids and they would become professional Vikings. And, if they got killed, they would fight. They became known for fighting viciously because a lot of them were not really looking at a very happy life. Their life is one raid after another. Kill or be killed, and if they died, then it's not like they had a lot to lose. These were people without a lot to lose. Um, so the Vikings were a symptom of the Dark Ages in many ways. Um, they represented a kind of random violence that could strike seemingly anywhere at any time, that was almost a pure expression of the violence built into the social system that I talked about in a previous video. Uh, the Vikings terrified the Europeans. Um, They would show up out of nowhere in their fast-moving small boats, small but very fast-moving boats. They would show up out of nowhere. They could reach places. They could travel up rivers because these were boats with a very shallow draft, so they did not sit heavy in the water. So they could travel up rivers, even very shallow rivers, and attack inland, seemingly at will. Um, they terrified the people of these areas that they would raid. Um, so the Vikings era was a very violent and frightening one for people. But eventually it did come to an end. And it bears asking how and why the Viking era came to an end. And the answer is interesting, because the Viking era began to come to an end in two ways. First of all, the people that the Vikings were raiding started to respond to these raids. And they had an interesting effect. The people of Europe living in these areas began to move closer together and form larger communities for mutual protection. But this was a trend against the localism of feudal society. This was a trend of people coming together and forming larger and larger communities that could defend themselves better from the Vikings, that weren't so isolated. And those forming those larger communities was part of it helped encourage the recovery of urban communities. It helped encourage the recovery of trade and the recovery of centralized power in Europe. So, weirdly enough, the Vikings helped spur along a trend that would be a part of Europe's transition from the Dark Ages to the High Middle Ages. The other thing, though, is that the Vikings, when they went to these places, eventually they got the idea that instead of just raiding them and taking their stuff and going home, that they could just stay there. Um, and they did. In the north of the British Isles, in Scotland, they just settled there. In Ireland, they just settled. Ireland's capital, Dublin, was settled originally by Vikings. In the north of France, they settled in an area called Normandy. And that area was called Normandy because of the Northmen. Normandy, Northmen that settled it. They just started to settle down. Instead of being raiders, they became the people who lived there, and they married into them and they mixed with them, and they became a part of the society. And they brought elements of the Scandinavian culture with them when they did, but they also mixed in with and absorbed local culture as well. So the Viking era ended kind of because they were making their own job harder. The more they raided, the more people responded to the raids with effective countermeasures. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is that they just found a better option than raiding. It was just they just found a better idea than raiding all the time. So the Viking era was significant in the transition from the Dark Ages to the High Middle Ages. But it was also fairly brief, only a couple of hundred years. Okay. Now let's contrast that with the other person I said I was going to talk about. Let's see. Let's make sure I covered everything. Who were they? Why did they raid? Where did they go? And what did they do there? Yeah, okay. I think we covered all of that. Okay. So let's talk about the next thing. Charlemagne. Yes, that's a French word, Charlemagne. So it looks weird. It's not pronounced the way it looks. It looks like it should be pronounced Charlemagne. Anyway, and the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. So who the poop was Charlemagne? Let's start with the basics. Charlemagne was a king in Europe in the late 700s. He was the son of Pepin the Short. That was his father. Pepin the Short was the son of Charles Martel, who was the son of Pepin. And all these guys were kings in what we would now call, probably what we would now call France, parts of France and parts of Germany. The way you can remember this is so Pepin the Short, Peppy the Short. There's Peppy, there's Charles Martel, and Martel is just the word for hammer. And so he was called basically Charlie Hammer. Charlie Hammer, Charles the Hammer, because he beat his enemies so effectively. So Pepin, Charlie Hammer, Pepin the Short, which sounds like a gangster or something. Peppy the Short, whatever. And then Charlemagne, which is just short, which is a Frenchification of the Latin Charles. I hate writing with my mouse. Charles Magnus, or if you're not feeling fancy, Magnus is just the Latin for great. Uh, and the great there can also mean large, the same word for really impressive or really large. He could be Big Charlie. So, Pepin, Charlie Hammer, Pepin the Short, and Big Charlie. Um, that's who we're dealing with. So Charlemagne was from a long line of kings in what we would now call France. France. Um, and what makes him special, the reason we care about him, and the reason he's called Charlie the Great, um, Charles Magnus, is because what he did was he sort of conquered an area that was larger than any king, than any of his parents, than any king in Europe during the medieval period up to this point had conquered. Um, it's important to point out that in the same time period, there were kings in England. Look how small England is compared to this area. And bear in mind, England had dozens of kingdoms in it. So these are kingdoms that are, as small as a county in Oklahoma. These were very small. It's a kingdom, but it's maybe 30 miles across if you're lucky. Whereas what Charlemagne did was Charlemagne conquered all of France and a good portion of Germany, or what we would now call Germany, and all of northern Italy. And he united them into a single, under his single rulership. Um, and that was a pretty impressive feat. Now, he wanted, why did he do this? Well, the thing is, Charlemagne, like other people in the Dark Ages, lived in the ruins of the Roman Empire, and he knew, as I said, that the Roman Empire had once dominated all of this area, had dominated England and all of this area, and it had dominated Spain and all of Italy and all of Greece and all of this, and it was everywhere. He knew that they were not as big and tough as the Roman Empire had been. But he wanted to bring back the glory of Rome. He knew they were in a dark age. He understood that something had been lost that he wanted to bring back. He grasped that. And so Charlemagne unites this whole area, and then he goes to the Pope. Again, I'm going to talk about the role of the church in the Middle Ages in another video. He goes to the Pope in Rome and asks the Pope to crown him. Now, he was already a king, so he's not asking the Pope to crown him king. He's asking the Pope to crown him Roman Emperor. Roman Emperor? There hasn't been a Roman Emperor in the West since 467. The last Roman Emperor died in 467. That was hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Charlie, what are you talking about, man? Stop huffing paint. Or whatever. No. What he wanted to do was intentionally recall the glory of Rome. There was no Roman Senate that could confer upon him the title of emperor, but there was the Pope, and people listened to the Pope because they were very religious. So he got the Pope to crown him Roman emperor and this is my favorite historical date because it's so easy to remember, on Christmas Day, December 25th, in the year 800. 800. Just 800, not 803 or 798 or some bullshit like that. It's just 800. Christmas Day, 800. December 25th, 800. Super easy. He gets the Pope to crown him as Holy Roman Emperor. And he called his realm the Holy Roman Empire. Holy because it was Christian and his authority was conferred by the Pope. Roman because he's intentionally trying to compare himself to the Roman emperors. And Empire, again, because he's trying to regain the lost glory of the empire. The Holy Roman Empire. Okay. Now, it wasn't Roman, and I don't know if it technically meets the definition of an empire. Whether it was holy is up for debate. But anyway, the name was good propaganda regardless. The Holy Roman Empire sounds very grand, and it sounds like it's recalling the glory of Rome. Just very, very special. Big Charlie's Holy Roman Empire is going to fall apart. I'll talk about that in a moment. But later on, other German rulers would try to revive the idea of the Holy Roman Empire. And that will happen later in the Middle Ages, and then it'll happen again after the Middle Ages. They're just going to keep bringing this idea up, trying to make it happen. Stop trying to make fetch happen. Stop trying to make the Holy Roman Empire happen. Anyway, they're going to do the thing. So, Big Charlie, what happens in the Holy Roman Empire at this point in time is referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, why is it called Carolingian? Well, again, that's more French bullshit. Carolingian is just the possessive form of Charlemagne, according to the French. Basically, this just means the Charlemagnean Renaissance, the Charlemagne's Renaissance. And why is it called a Renaissance? Remember, Renaissance is French for rebirth, because what Charlemagne was trying to do was bring about a rebirth of old Roman civilization. He reformed the laws. He founded schools. He tried to make the roads in the entirety of his Holy Roman Empire. He tried to make the roads safe by having patrols on the roads. He tried to settle the disputes among his nobles, not with warfare, but with legal procedures. He was trying to make Europe civilized again. Did he succeed? I mean, a little. Not really. He lasted from 800 to 814 when he died. So he made it about 14 years. When he died, his empire, such as it is, was split up between his three sons. Rather than just having one of them take over, his three sons took over. Each of them got a different part of the empire. And naturally, as you might imagine, they immediately started fighting with each other. They were not interested in continuing the Carolingian Renaissance. They just wanted to rule the whole thing themselves. So these brothers started fighting with each other and trying to kill each other. And basically, that's when everything went to hell in a handbasket again. It didn't last, this Holy Roman Empire. The Carolingian Renaissance didn't last. But it was a noble effort. It was an attempt. It was a sign that some people were trying, striving for something more civilized than the chaotic, violent society of Dark Ages Europe. They wanted something more. And even if Charlemagne, Big Charlie, wasn't able to pull it off, that didn't mean that it was never going to happen. So, okay. So anyway, so that's my brief talk about the Middle Ages in general. Again, I think this graphic will help you. The Middle Ages in general, the Dark Ages, I can't really go into a bunch of stuff from the Dark Ages, so I just hit a highlight there with the Vikings and with Charlemagne. Next time, we're going to talk about the transition period in the 11th century, and then we're going to start getting into the High Middle Ages, and that will take us up through a couple of videos on that will take us up to the Renaissance, and then that's where I have to stop. Because the Humanities 2 teachers will all beat me up if I go into the Renaissance. They protect their turf. They're going to rumble. Um, and it's going to be ugly. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording videos for today because I've done way too much and my voice is failing and I don't know what's real anymore. All right. So have a good day. Bye.